Good morning. This is Yolanda Curry from the Chicago Department of Family and Support Services. I'm beginning our webinar session for the RFP for DFSS Senior Satellite Centers. In the room with me, I have Julia Talbot, who will take on all the technical aspects of this, and I will focus more primarily on the programmatic issues. In addition, I have Tom Moles, who is helping on the technical side of today's webinar, and I'm reading your questions out loud. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on DFSS YouTube channel. The PowerPoint will be available and sent to you. Please type your questions in the right-hand side dashboard. Thanks. We will take some of your questions for clarification, but I'll save your questions until the end of the presentation. So with that, we will go ahead and begin this webinar session. I think we've kind of gone through the introductions and who we have here from the DSFS team. At this point, we will begin the actual RFP review, and depending on how we're going, we will take questions at the end of the session. Next slide. So the Chicago Department of Family and Support Service merged in 2009. Prior to that, we were a number of, I believe, 7 individual departments. Our department happens to be the greatest funder in the city of Chicago of social services. We are a one-stop shop, if you will. Our programming begins with early learning opportunities for children, all the way through senior services, and as illustrated on the PowerPoint slide, you can see the number of divisions and services that we provide here at the Chicago Department of Family and Support Services. Next slide. So in 2016, when our commissioner came to DFSS, one of the things that she was kind of proud to announce is, generally speaking, that we were on track with our programming, and so it allowed us to, if you will, to look at other kind of initiatives that the department can enact. And so one of those things was to really kind of take a look at our mission statement. The mission statement that we had previously, while it encompassed what it was that we did, it was kind of long and most people couldn't repeat it. So we thought that if we would kind of trim it down and then have a robust conversations amongst the team to see what kind of edicts we wanted to kind of go forward with as a department. So as you can see, the bigger parts of our mission is really working with, if you will, the residents of the city to build stability, to support their well-being and empower them to thrive. So the 3 core principles are building stability, supporting well-being, and empowering people to thrive. Sorry, I have a cold today, so please bear with me. In terms of priorities of our department, it is the deliver high quality programs, collaborating with community agencies and sister partners, and making sure that we're providing information and being a good steward of public resources. Next slide. So as it relates to the Senior Services Division, we are, if you will, an agency within the agency. We're the local area agency for the city of Chicago. There are 13 area agencies located across the state of Illinois, about 640 or so across the country. In the role of the local area agency, our primary targets are to plan, advocate, and coordinate services for older adults, in particular those with greatest economic and social needs, individuals living alone, and those 85 years of age or older. In terms of some of the core programming that we provide, it is our senior centers, our congregate dining program, our home delivered meal program, our health promotion programs. We have senior employment and volunteer activities, as well as caregiver and in-home services, our ombudsman program, and our information and assistance unit. Generally speaking, it is a wonderful time to be in senior services. It is what we would like to say the coming of age of baby boomers. And by 2030, just as a fact for you, there'll be more 65-year-olds in the world than children, as reported by the Census Bureau. More importantly, that we spend a little time to think of how we're aligning services in the Senior Services Division. So our senior satellite centers, just generally speaking, when we're talking about the model of senior centers, it is one of the most recognizable and flexible models of services provided through the Act. Generally speaking, there are about 10,000 senior centers across the United States, and we serve 1 million older adults across the country every day. So, as it relates to this RFP, what we're looking to do here is to provide opportunities to older adults to participate in a wide range of programs and services that will address their well-being, provide information and link them to community and departmental resources. The Senior Center, as a form of intervention, has really a lot of positive effects for older adults. Participation in our programs and services can manage or delay the onset of chronic disease, and seniors can maintain and or improve their physical, social, spiritual, emotional, and economic well-being. So when we think about our senior center intervention and those things that we're going to look at as it relates to performance to see if we are on track to move in the dial forward, we're going to be looking at client satisfaction, the number of new participants that we're bringing into the system, and those who are returning for a second visit during the calendar year. Next slide. So generally speaking, when we're talking about our senior centers and what it is that we're trying to do, we're trying to serve as a gateway to aging network services to adopt innovative strategies to address social isolation. The research tends to indicate social isolation being a major problem here, not only in this country, but across the world. In fact, I think a recent study suggested that social isolation can be as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So again, as terms of intervention, senior center participation, what we want to do is we want to promote social connection and enforce and implement positive aging strategies. So in terms of what it means to be a satellite center programmer or an operator or our community-based partner, what we're looking for in terms of this RFP and those programmatic responsibilities is for the respondent to perform the role as the day-to-day operator of the center. That includes opening the doors and facilitating programming, reporting incidents, and just making sure that the center is open and operational. We're looking to assure that you're hiring and retaining personnel and managing volunteers to support the center, that increasingly that we are managing our ability to bring in diverse population of older adults, and increasingly with people who have more complex physical and social needs. Also, that we want to remove any barriers as it relates to language and culture, and that we have specific plans to address that. One of the more newer strategies in terms of programming for our satellite centers and or regional centers is our executive director's vision of enacting villages around each of the centers. And that is more of an outreach campaign to reach out to those who are more socially isolated and at risk in the community. There are a number of people who will traditionally walk through the doors, but then there are people that otherwise, if we don't go out to reach them, that we may not. So it is this concept of building a safety net around them to assure that those people are aging in the community with support. And then lastly, we're going to work cooperatively to make sure that we are utilizing resources and making sure that there are sustainable funding streams for programs and services. Any other resources that you have to bear that you want to bring, those things can be, if you will, encapsulated in your RFP, but will have to be approved by DFSS. Sorry. In terms of our population and targets that we have to reach, for the purposes of this program, we're looking to reach older adults 55 years of age or older, those who have greatest economic and or social need, with particular attention to those who are low-income minorities, those older persons with limited English proficiencies, and just in terms of this concept of promoting positive aging. We want to assure that we are reaching out to early adopters of senior center programs, and or to really make sure that we're bringing people in as they reach 55 years of age or older. In terms of the core programs that we're providing in our Senior Satellite Initiative, it is fitness programming. We have a citywide provider who will, on schedule, be providing fitness services at each of the centers. In addition, we have the Golden Diners or Congregate Dining program, where a number of seniors will receive, if you will, a lunch program in a couple of targeted locations. They're both breakfast and lunch. In terms of health promotion, we have citywide contracts with a number of agencies to bring in healthcare professionals and offer evidence-based curriculums related to health promotions. In terms of that health promotion team, we have dietitians, social workers, pharmacists, and registered nurses who will come out and do one-on-one consults as well as monthly presentations to address the ongoing needs of older adults. We are looking to make sure that we're a one-stop shop or there's no wrong door for a person who walks through our facilities. And in that regard, we're looking for this operator to plug into the system overall and to provide linkage to information and community resources. And recreation programming. So our recreation programming can take the form of very, if you will, informal programming. So it could be seniors chatting at the table, playing cards, playing billiards, but we also have what we call our life enrichment programs. And from there, we have a registry of approved instructors. The rates have already been negotiated. Each center will receive that budget, and from that budget, you will select programming with the input of the participants at your center. So that could be in the form of a Zumba, it could be Tai Chi, it could be English as a second language. Again, a wide range of programs that we can put in place to, again, you know, if you will, interest the senior and have them engage. Each center has a computer lab and Wi-Fi availability, and then the notion of the village. Each satellite center will be asked to work cooperatively with the DFSS team in the development and ongoing growth of villages at each of the centers. So in terms of performance as it relates to this particular program model, when we're tracking progress, these are the primary factors that initially we're going to be looking at. And that is, you know, this particular program of services is only good if the seniors are related and they're happy with it. So we will do a point in time survey with the participants at the centers, and we're looking for 85% or greater in terms of client satisfaction with the services of the center. We're looking to, again, this is not a static program. Our work is never done. Annually, in 2018, we served about 30,000 seniors through our service system. But what we know is that number of seniors in the city of Chicago is growing. So in terms of touch and impact, you know, they're closer to 600,000 seniors or will be there soon. So we can always work to, again, bring seniors into our service system. So we're looking for a rate of growth of 15% or better over the last year's performance. And then when we have these newly engaged participants, we want them to return. So the other factor that we're going to be looking at is we want to assure that at least whoever we register over the year return for at least one second visit over the calendar year. So again, in terms of our kind of metrics and other things that we're counting, we're looking at, again, the number of total unduplicated participants served by the center, the number of visits to the centers overall. In FY 2018, we had over 500,000 or 500,000 visits to our senior centers, and that's both our 6 regional centers and our 15 satellite centers. However, the rate of growth of satellites are growing And in 2018, 53% of all visits came from satellite centers. So satellite centers visitors, at least in the last calendar year, was slightly higher than those who were participating at our 6 regional centers. And again, we're looking at the number of new participants we're bringing into the satellite center system. So as it relates to selection criteria and what we're looking for in terms of this RFP, the first area is the strength of your proposed program, and that is that you can clearly demonstrate you have an understanding of our target population and their needs and challenges. The second of which is to look at addressing the desired outcomes of the target population. We're looking to see that the applicant has a sound strategy to address our limited English speakers. And also, as it relates to your program, when you're thinking of your program model, how well you've looked at, if you will, best practices and or other kind of evidence-based programming as it relates to the senior centers. And then the last one is that you are thinking about or being very intentional about how you are going to retain new program participants. The next area that we're going to look at is then your performance against like those performance metrics and those other goals that were noted earlier. If you have not done this work, again, we're looking at the strength of your proposal and your understanding of how it is that you are going to be able to operate these programs with fidelity and, again, assure that we are reaching our program targets. The other part of this is your ability, one, to have like a sound staffing pattern, as well as your ability to collect the information and the data and evaluate your performance. And then once you are collecting that data, is how you're using data to, if you will, inform and or improve upon your current services and or practices. In terms of organizational capacity, we want to look to see that the organization is sound, has quality staffing pattern. You guys are clearly articulating program oversight, management, and then fiscal oversight and fundraising and then the overall strength of the organization. That you guys are, if you will, looking at like your reporting and monitoring structures to assure that, you know, your program expenditures, you know, meet both strong internal controls and you have great systems in place. We're looking at your history in terms of serving the target population and then the plan that you have to address it for the purposes of this program proposal. And then the last item here is looking at the diversity of the community and making sure you have a strong plan to be inclusive of the community with your work and then using other community partners and then your relationship working with the local community. In terms of reasonable cost, the budget justification and the leverage of funds, we want to make sure that you guys have a strong plan and foundation as it relates to the finances and human resources, and that you just have a strong overall scope for service or work plan, that the agency has financial capacity. This is a reimbursement-based program, and so you first have to, if you will, spend the dollars to actually be reimbursed for it. And that you guys have audited financial statements as well. And so those are some of the core components as it relates to the cost and budget justification. Next slide. Okay, so that was a mouthful. Okay, so the bottom line here is applications are due April 12, 2019 at 12 noon. And that is a very firm deadline. This is an electronic process. And so once you kind of reach that deadline, you will no longer be able to submit your application. So our advice would be to try to get it in early to make sure that you will make that deadline. Okay. Just as a reminder, please type any questions you have on your dashboard. Thank you. And so at this point, I'm going to let Julia kind of take over a little bit to talk more about the technical aspect.
So this is just a little bit about how you're going to make your application into the eProcurement system. We have a number of different things to help you should you run into trouble. If your organization does not have an account in eProcurement, or iSupplier is another word for it, you'll need to do that, and you should budget 2 or 3, maybe 4 days for that process. You basically request an application, and then you'll be sent a link from our Department of Procurement at the city, and that sometimes it takes a couple of days for them to get back to you. So we suggest that you get going on this application as quickly as possible, just so if you have to set up that account in iSupplier, you have built-in time for that 3 or 4 day waiting period. Once you get into iSupplier, it's fairly straightforward as to how to navigate it. You'll see the application, which is a series of narrative questions. The narrative boxes are, and this comes up on subsequent slides, the narrative boxes are limited to 4,000 characters, which includes punctuation and spaces. And that is going to be, so 4,000 characters is about 2 paragraphs, maybe a little bit more, to provide your answers. So, careful editing is always appreciated and in some cases highly necessary. But if you have questions about your registration, there's those email addresses and a hotline that goes to our department, the Office of Budget and Management. And there's also a pretty robust collection of training materials, both kind of step-by-step manuals and videos on how to do some things in the eProcurement system that you might need to do, either for setting up your application or making an application, or vouchering, setting up your company's site, login on iSupplier eProcurement. So there's a number of things number of training materials. But I really do suggest, if you're running into problems, that you reach out to those email addresses, or call the hotline, or you can call me. I don't always have the right level of access to solve a lot of your problems on the eProcurement site, but I can, especially if you've made several calls or whatever, you just haven't been able to connect with somebody. I always like to know about that, and I'm good at bothering or bugging the Office of Budget and Management on people's behalf to make sure that those things or any kind of questions that you have are resolved. So as Yolanda said, we always encourage people to start early on their applications. So if you haven't registered into iSupplier eProcurement, do so now. When you get in, review the application questions and narratives. They'll look different this year from prior. Both prior applications for senior satellites, because we have a slightly different scope, as well as maybe prior applications that you might have encountered for other RFPs. We've sort of been tinkering with the application questions. They're not necessarily the same old that you might have become used to. I always say, review the selection criteria. The selection criteria directly feeds from the scope of services in your RFP. So when we start to build an RFP, we have a scope. From the scope, we pick out salient bullet points that end up being part of the selection criteria. And out from the selection criteria, the application questions come out of the selection criteria. And our evaluation questions basically are response directly to the evaluation questions, but also the selection criteria. So when you think to yourself, I don't really know how to answer this question, or I don't really know what direction I should be taking, I suggest that you would review the selection criteria to see if that gives you a little guidance. And if you don't feel it's enough, I would also review the scope. You can pretty much figure out what we're looking for and what you need to do, or how to frame the questions. Of course, if you find it to be completely that we just don't make any sense to you, you should call Yolanda and she can clarify. I always encourage people to use spell check. I try to use spell check myself. I encourage my children to use spell check. I will pretty much at this point, stop strangers on the street and ask them to use spell check as well. Especially, the nonsensical words are kind of interesting, but occasionally people, the autocorrect or whatever will replace a word that makes sense, but not the sense you wanted it to make. So I encourage people to use spell check, constantly. Now, in terms of some tips for working in the eProcurement environment, this came up prior in the online or in the in-person pre-submittal that we did last week. You can submit multiple applications. If you want to make an application for multiple sites, you're going to have to submit multiple applications. You can't just lump 5 requests or 5 site requests into one application, unfortunately. And the way that this system works is that each of those applications has to be connected to a unique email address. So if you are, Beyonce Knowles, and you're working at, senior service agency, you can't, you're going to have to set up, and you want to make 5 different applications for 5 different senior satellite centers. You're going to have to do, Beyonce Knowles 1 at AOL.com, Beyonce Knowles 2 at AOL.com, because the system is not going to allow you to just use that one email address, unfortunately, to set up all of the applications. And if it does, what it's going to really be doing is erasing all prior applications. So if it lets you do that, what it means is that you've just written over the application that application number 1, you wrote over with number 2, and that number 2 is what's going to get submitted, and you're not going to get those 5 things submitted. Let me know if I need to repeat that. I know it's both painful and confusing. So you just need to have each application has to be connected to a separate email account. There's the 4,000 character limit, which I discussed prior. You can submit your application prior to the April 12th deadline, and I highly suggest and hope that you do. One of the nice things about features to this system is that if you submit it and you later decide you want to add something, you forgot something, whatever, if it's up until that April 12th deadline, you can pull that application back and resubmit it. So you can be like, oh, I didn't put in this resume, or I want to answer this question a little bit differently. I already hit submit. If it's prior to the deadline, you can pull it back, make your update, and then resubmit. We always like people to submit early, just so that if something goes wrong with your computer, with our computers, with anybody's computers, that you're not caught in a bind, because we really do not. So this system doesn't allow us to do late applications. The only way we can accept an application past the due date is to re-release the entire RFP, which means that every other person who got their application on time will be asked to then submit again, which is not really fair. So we really are not in a position that we can do a late application. We can't accept it. The system won't accept it. And we are trying very hard not to have to repost RFPs that we already posted once. As I was said before, really make use of that eProcurement hotline. If you're not getting the response in terms of response time that you want, do call or reach out to me. My email address and my phone number are at the end of this PowerPoint. I believe they're also in the RFP document. In the case of an addendum or a notification, this is what you will get something. If you've started your application, you will get, or if you're logged into the system, you will get this thing saying that you're acknowledged. You need to acknowledge the amendment. And if you can see on this is the screen that you would see. It talks about, we circled the acknowledge required amendment just so that it says, so you know that it's an amendment and that you need to acknowledge it. Basically, what you need to do is go to that lower box where it says review changes in blue and click on that. You will review the changes to the RFP that we've made, accept them, and if you've started an application already, that acceptance will pull your application forward into this new amended RFP. So if you haven't started an application, and you're just logging in and starting for the first time, you'll see that the RFP or the RFQ number is slightly changed. So if it was, I'm trying to think what, if it, this one is 6762. If we amended it, it would become 6762, 1. If that was the first amendment, if we did any subsequent amendment or notifications, it would, go up to 6762, 2. We try not to do addendums or amendments or notifications. Generally, it's because if we do, sometimes it's for uploading an FAQ sheet, or we have, for some reason, need to extend the deadline. Those are really the only 2 reasons that I can come up with as to why we do, why we traditionally do addendums. But there's, always room for new things to crop up, and it's nice that we have this capacity. So here we are. I'm going to hand this back to Yolanda. We have a few question and answers that came up in the pre-submittal that we did last week, that we wanted to make sure that these questions were addressed so you didn't have to ask them. And so here we go. It was, is it acceptable to co-locate other services or offices of the delegate in the satellite center? And can applicants do other business or provide other services or serve other populations at the satellite centers? Then also an additional kind of aspect of that question would be, could a delegate provide senior satellite services at a different location than the ones that we currently have?
Okay. So in terms of collating an additional service, if you will, at the satellite center, the answer is yes, it's possible. However, that service must have programmatic benefit to the older adult. And so it should be something that's value added for the senior center in general and the older adults who participate there. It should not have an inherent conflict of interest and not impede the operation of the center, and does not take away from the fidelity of what our senior center initiative is. As it relates to age, these programs or services should be something that's geared to older adults, 55 years of age or older. For the purposes of this RFP, the satellite center services have to happen, if you will, in the 15 addresses outlined in the request for proposal. So yes, possibly you could co-locate a service if it is senior specific and it has a benefit to older adults and it doesn't kind of interfere with the business of the satellite center, and or programs and services should be geared to older adults 55 years of age or older. So another question that arose was if you would describe the reimbursement process for the city of Chicago. And the first part of it is that it is a reimbursement contract. So advances will not be provided. So you have to have, if you will, cash on hand to be able to make those, first expenditures. And then you're working through the process, if you will, to be reimbursed. In addition, the city used a web-based electronic vouchering system. And generally speaking, we look for people to invoice on a monthly basis. Generally speaking, we're asking people to perform, if you will, submit their documentation no later than 15 days following the month of the actual dates of services performed or when you're incurring costs. Another question that kind of came up is people wanted to know of the existing providers, who was the actual service provider at each location. And so what we tried to do is put this information here where you see City of Chicago, DFSS. That is a center currently where we have a city staffer. The other ones will list the actual community-based partner organization that is providing services. So at this time, we will entertain any other questions.
Hi, everyone. This is Tom again. Thank you all that registered and attended for today's webinar. We have some great questions, so I'll read them out loud, and Yolanda will, or Julia will do their best to answer them. And again, just type your questions in your dashboard. And the first one is, does DFSS provide a calendar of required activities and events?
And so the answer to that is yes. We kind of work together, if you will, with a delegate agency provider, and so there'll be a set schedule. So for example, if we were talking about fitness programming, the community-based partner would be given the schedule of when it is that the fitness classes should be occurring and or when the personal trainer will be on site. That information then, if you will, is translated to a monthly calendar that, if you will, outlines, and the community-based partner publishes once a month with all activities happening at the center. So it's going to contain, for example, the fitness programming when the healthcare professionals there. A lot of times, the time that lunch, is being served daily. If there are any of our presentations or special events, and then any other programming that you guys are bringing to bear. So yes, we provide, that feedback in terms of what that programming looks like, and then we are communicating that out, generally speaking, on a monthly basis in a calendar that we provide to the public, as well as there's a quarterly publication that we also put highlights of kind of what's happening at the center, and it's then distributed citywide to over 30,000 individuals.
Thank you. The next question is, if we don't currently have a senior program, but have recognized the need and can develop and execute one with fidelity, are we eligible to apply? Essentially, does not currently having a programming for this population a disqualifier?
So, no, what I would say is that this happens to be, if you will, one of the most supported program models, if you will, like in a senior services division. I like to say that it is our a form of a franchise in terms of really what the programming we're looking for and what we want to be executed is fairly well laid out. The only exception to that is that at this point in time, we're only looking for services to be put in place in those actual 15 locations outlined in the RFP. So we're not looking for expansion to other buildings or facilities at this time, but instead assuring that we have community-based partner organizations who's going to help us staff, if you will, those existing 15.
The next question is, what are examples of the initial voucher expenses?
And so I would say that primarily a lot of what we're doing here is we're paying for infrastructure costs. So we're paying the telephone, we're paying the cable, we're paying any operator expenses, we're paying any rent. The one thing that is glaringly necessarily not covered are, if you will, like personnel costs. So the $80,000 in terms of whatever kind of staffing model that's being put forward is probably going to be an example of that. And so if our said agency and I don't know, was, going to have a part-time and a full-time manager, let's say, in terms of what we've been looking for is, how you've incurred like those costs to pay those staff, and then you would provide that documentation to us, and then, you would be reimbursed for those expenses.
Thank you. Are the partner agencies like Catholic Charities no longer going to operate the sites they are currently funding?
So what this is what do I want to say? This is an open and fair competitive process. So that's not to say that Catholic Charities or any of these other operators will not be submitting applications to continue that work. However, as a new funding, opportunity exists. Before a lot of that work was done pro bono, we have to open it up and entertain proposals for whoever it is that desires to apply.
When can we expect a registry of instructors for the life enrichment programs?
So I think as part of this process, we're not necessarily going to, if you will, provide the registry. I think instead that registry will be provided once we've identified, the actual operators for those centers.
Is there some place where we can see what the complete current costs are to operate these senior centers? And if so, can we get that data for the past 3 years?
I would say that would be fairly onerous for us, depending on what the buildings are. And again, a lot of those costs are not necessarily costs that we are passing on to you. So I don't necessarily think that we will be providing that data. And I'll give you an example. So say, for example, some could be rent, some could be telephone, some could be light utilities, and a lot of those expenses, if you will, go back to the city's Department of Fleet and Facility Management and a number of other kind of places, or the city telecom. And so a lot of those expenses are not necessarily dollars that we readily have the information to be able to answer your questions that way. So in terms of, again, the cost associated with operating the centers here, the programming and all those other things are, if you will, taken care of. What is not, generally speaking, relates to the personnel cost.
Does a provider have to adhere to present satellite center locations only?
So,
sorry about that. Let me say that again. Does a provider have to adhere to the present satellite center locations only?
Yes. We are only looking at this point to get a community-based operator for one of the 15 locations listed in the request for proposal.
And by the way, everyone, these are great questions. We're actually at our last question. If you have any more, please type them in your dashboard. Thank you. Okay, can you say more about the cap on administrative costs, please?
So generally speaking, and I will confirm with our finance team, but generally speaking, we try to keep admin costs at about 10%. And so other than that, the rest of the cost should be directly relatable to providing programs and services on behalf of the satellite center. We'll take a minute to see if you have any additional questions, and we'll be right back with you. Okay. So, Thomas, if you want to read the last question.
Yeah, we have a couple more here. If we are already in the eProcurement system, do we need to do an update regarding the RFP?
You don't need to, you would need to update your account in eProcurement if you have changes that you need to register. But other than that, if everything is actually absolutely the same as far as that account is concerned, you should be able to log in, you should be able to get to the application relatively easily and just get started.
And one of the last questions is, so our responsibility is only for personnel costs?
Primarily speaking, yes. However, some people may, I don't know if they're thinking in their model that they want to devote a little bit more toward programming, and so they could do so. But in terms of what is not currently kind of, if you will, accounted for in our budgeting here at the City of Chicago, it is personnel costs. All right. Well, again, thank everyone for coming out and participating in our webinar. And with the last question kind of being answered, we're going to sign out here. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and thank you for attending today's session. Bye-bye.